But I wanted to ask something extremely naive here. I wanted to ask, how bad was the terror really? Because a lot of the times this period seems sort of instrumentalized from different sides of the political spectrum today. People on the left will say that it was, mainly the fattening parasitic aristocrats who got the chop, while folks on the right will claim that ordinary citizens were indiscriminately killed left and right, and then also try to paint the entire revolution as basically being one big slaughterhouse.
Mhm.
Who's closer to the truth here?
No, it's a very complicated situation. I mean, one way of thinking about it in terms of, I mean, the focus on death, for example,
Yeah,
um,
and the guillotine.
and the guillotine. I mean, there is a rhetoric of death. There is a rhetoric of the guillotine that seems to wallow in a lot of this. But if you compare it to the American Revolution, which is very much part of the same historical situation. I mean, the population of the American colonies is only about a tenth of the population of France. So it's a very different scale. But in terms of the intensity of violence, the intensity of death and persecution and political exile, relative to those 3 million people in the American colonies, it was as intense as it was to the 28 million people in France.
Interesting.
Proportionally, there's not a lot of difference. It's just that in the American case, a lot of it is dispersed across the frontier. A lot of the violence is hard to see until people have really dug into the record of what 8 years of warfare were actually like. And it doesn't have with it this destructive, demonizing rhetoric, which is completely attached to what happens in France. So as I've already said, at the level of numbers of actual deaths in France, you have some really horrific totals. 250,000 people in the Vendée, probably another 30 or 40,000 people executed for armed rebellion elsewhere in the country. Over 2,500 people formally tried and executed by guillotine for what are often completely imaginary political crimes, but at the root of which there is a real ongoing conflict that the political authorities are trying to wrestle with. So the large material situation is as it were understandable, and relative to other major civil war type conflicts, not disproportionate. Um, but what does distinguish the French Revolutionary Terror is the way it's incapable of not consuming itself. The level at which paranoia of counter-revolutionary conspiracy translates to a willingness to very rapidly get rid of former close political allies is particularly distinctive in the period. You don't see that in the American context. That they have a few of famous traitors, people like Benedict Arnold, but they're not conducting sort of political witch hunts on a weekly basis.
Purges.
Purges, and this is what you have in France from the end of 1793, very explicitly using that precise language. I mean, they talk about épuration, which is purification, but it's also purge. It is the vocabulary that came down to us, through the sort of Leninist left, that they've already decided from the summer and autumn of 1793 that their own structures, their own political societies, their own political are riddled with counter-revolution. Because obviously, if they weren't, everything would be going better. I mean, and this is the paranoia. It just works it through. Month after month, they are finding reasons to treat disagreement of one kind about political tactics, military tactics, strategy, to treat disagreement as evidence of latent counter-revolution, and to pursue people for that, and to imprison them, and to put them on trial, so that by the end of 1793. They've locked up a significant proportion of the officer corps, for example, and they're starting to think that actually the rot goes all the way into the heart of the political class. By the spring of 1794, you have this infamous period where factional disputes by kind of ultra-leftists on the one hand and moderates-ish on the other become an excuse for the leadership between them to destroy both groups. But those groups are dissenting from correct behavior in different ways, but both ways are objectively counter-revolutionary, and so they are wrapped up in what are fundamentally absurd charges of conspiracy with foreign enemies, literally fabricated conspiracies.
Is
And
there a
these are,
trial for these people, or do they go straight to the
well,
guillotine?
this
Or
this is the process of trial before what they've now got this revolutionary tribunal. The process of trial is that of articulating these absurd conspiratorial allegations, and then people who've been handpicked to make up the jury agree that it's guillotining time, and off they go. It is brutally absurd, and increasingly as you go through these years, through these months, really, the first 7 months of 1794, you're looking at a political culture which is living with a threat of death, which is absurd. The things for which you can be arrested, the things for which you can be suspected, are absurd. The degree to which there's no telling from week to week whether you'll get a fair hearing in a public political setting, in the Jacobin Club or in the convention. You might get a fair hearing, you might get an applauded speech, you might get agreement, or you might literally be arrested. You might be taken off in the middle of the night and put on
what were
trial.
some of the absurd things that you could get arrested for in that time?
Well, I think, I mean, it's all absurd.
Okay.
It's all hinging on the idea that the things that people did were evidence that they were counter-revolutionary conspirators. And therefore, anything you did could be turned into evidence. Even, not agreeing forcefully enough with something stupid that someone else said could be turned into evidence that you were a secret counter-revolutionary. The Parisian authorities come up with a list earlier on, the end of the previous summer, September 1793. They come up with a list of things which would mark people out as unworthy citizens, to whom they, like, what they call carte de civisme, like sorts of political passports, would not be issued to this list of people. And it's a list of people which includes things like being too pessimistic, being too worried about how the war was going,
I'm sorry, Professor,
or
but yeah, a bit
not,
of dark humor there, I
yeah,
have to say.
not being enthusiastic enough in public assemblies,
I would be
um,
a goner.
yeah, not speaking up, claiming that you had nothing to say. This was itself evidence that you were secretly a counter-revolutionary. You have to stand there and you have to make, what Orwell talks about Soviet communism. These people are half gangster, half gramophone. You're supposed to just churn out the approved slogans at the approved moment at the approved volume, or else. Yeah. But the deeper absurdity of all of this is it's always already breaking down. It's not like Soviet communism. They can't keep it going for decades. It breaks down by June and July 1794.
Just one quick question. Was
Yeah.
anybody at the time at the top going like, "Hey fellas, I think we're overdoing this a little bit. I think this is getting a little bit absurd," or would this kind of articulation already mark you out for persecution and death?
Well, this is exactly how it ends. I mean, it ends because Maximilian Robespierre, in particular, as this kind of prophet of purity, has backed himself into a corner by July 1794, where the only way he can be consistent to what he already believes, to what he sees around him, is to start saying that almost literally everyone except him and a tiny circle of true believers are objectively counter-revolutionary. And by late July, he is saying this publicly, that the people and the convention need to get together and somehow purge themselves of what, in some lakes, looks like the majority of everyone. And other individual political leaders who've seen other factions go to the guillotine, who know that they personally have annoyed Robespierre and his friends, they are able finally to say, look, fellas,
We're next.
hang together or hang separately. We have to do something about this. And the final ultimate absurdity is that what they do, what happens on the 9th of Thermidor, and particularly in the days afterwards, after Robespierre is safely dead, is that they will accuse him of being that thing that everyone else was accused of being. Robespierre will be publicly declared to have been intending to crown himself King of France and to marry the former king's daughter and to make peace with the crowned heads of Europe over the top of the bodies of the French. He will be declared to be the arch counter-revolutionary, and that will justify the extermination of him and all his friends. And then they will spend the next several months just figuring out how big a sigh of relief they can take, how dangerous things still are. The irony being that the military situation has now improved to the point where France is really dominant on the battlefield. By 1794 into 1795, the military threat has been crushed, but it also involved the crushing of this paranoid political leadership.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing to Smart Cookies on YouTube. What else is there? Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you really liked what you heard, feel free to become my Patreon. No, my patron on Patreon by going to Patreon and becoming my patron. It's really easy. Just type Smart Cookies Podcast in there. You should be able to find me. Last but not least, I have to thank the absolute legends that are my producers on this show, my existing patrons on Patreon: Aida, Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Gordon, Jurechuk, Lorenzo, Mila, Carmen, Taichi, Goran, and Veronica. Without you guys, this show wouldn't exist. So massive thanks. And yeah, see you in the next episode. Bye.